It's November the 4th, 2005, and we're here to interview our friend and colleague, Ambassador Hal Saunders, as part of the Parents of the Field project that we are conducting to look back on the beginnings of the field of conflict analysis and resolution and peace studies, and we're delighted to see you here, Hal. And my first question is, in the early days of this field, people came into it from a wide variety of backgrounds, some intellectual and academic, some practical. How did you first get attracted to this particular field, and how did you actually become part of it?
Well, my route was, of course, through government. I had been in the government since 1957, but I went to the National Security Council staff in the White House in 1961. And just before the '67 war in the Middle East, became the senior person on the staff for Near East and South Asia. Of course, my introduction to the field was really in the 1970s, after the 1973 war, when I began flying on the Kissinger shuttles. And it was on the shuttles that we, I think, named for the first time the process that we were engaged in, the peace process. We started calling it a negotiating process, but realized that the series of interim agreements between Egypt and Israel, Syria and Israel, that we helped to mediate, that they were changing the political environment. So instead of thinking of ourselves as negotiating or mediating a series of interim agreements, we felt that we needed the broader term, because what we were doing, as I say, changed the political environment in a way that made it possible to negotiate or mediate later what couldn't have been done the day before. So I took away from that the Kissinger shuttles, my participation in the Camp David Accords, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty in the 1970s, most of which time I was in the State Department as Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Near East, South Asia, dealing with the peace process, then as Director of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, still active in the peace process, and finally as Assistant Secretary of State. And I was at Camp David with Carter, Begin, and Sadat, and helped mediate the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. But I think I took away several lessons from that process, which became relevant to the field, at least for me. Well, the first lesson I took away from the Arab-Israeli peace process was the power of a continuous political process to transform relationships. One agreement piled on top of another, for the purpose of opening up the Arab-Israeli relationship. So that was lesson number one. But a very strong corollary to that was to recognize the human dimension of that conflict. And for me, ultimately, that led to my speaking about relationships as a significant target of any peace process, transforming relationships. And we'll probably come back to that later. But so it was the sense that a political process to transform the relationships. And third, I think, was reflecting on whole bodies politic rather than just on government-to-government relations. In other words, the Sadat visit to Jerusalem was not a significant contribution to a breakthrough on issues then under negotiation. It was an incredible breakthrough in terms of the Israeli people's sudden realization that maybe it was possible to develop a more peaceful relationship with an Arab country. So these three lessons, the power of a political process, the human dimensions of the process, and the focus on the overall relationship between two parties in conflict, not just what governments were doing to each other. I left government in 1981, and within the year became associated with what was by then a 20-year-old non-official dialogue between Soviet citizens and American citizens called the Dartmouth Conference, named for the place of the first meeting in October 1960. So I became involved in that. At the meeting that I attended, the first of my plenary Dartmouth meetings in November of 1981, the question on the agenda was, what happened to détente, the effort during the 1970s to reduce tensions between the superpowers? And the answers lay in two arenas. One was arms control and arms deployments, mostly in Europe. And second was the interaction of the Soviet Union and the United States in what we called regional conflicts, those areas where the superpowers competed through proxies. Afghanistan, Middle East, Southern Africa, Nicaragua, and so on. I was asked by the Kettering Foundation, which was the U.S. manager of the U.S. side of this bilateral dialogue, to be the co-chair, U.S. co-chair of the Regional Conflicts Task Force. My opposite number on the Soviet side was Yevgeny Primakov, who later became the foreign minister and then prime minister of the new Russia. When I sat down at the table, and incidentally I've just been, for another project, rereading the near verbatim transcripts that we have of those meetings. So if one is looking for documentation, which is a common plea in evaluating these processes, in the case of the Dartmouth Regional Conflicts Task Force, it's there in spades. But I've been rereading those records recently, and one of the reasons I mentioned the lessons that I brought into the non-official field of dialogue and conflict transformation, the reason I mentioned the lessons I brought into it were that at the first meeting of the task force, I actually said, I understand the mandate of this task force is to probe the interactions of the Soviet Union and the United States in conflicts far from their borders in order to learn more about what we then called the central relationship, in order to learn more about the Soviet-U.S. relationship. So that's where I started into the field of non-official conflict prevention, having gotten my experience in more than a decade of official diplomatic efforts.
You mentioned Landry Bowling, and you've talked a little bit about his influence. Who else introduced you to the field and got you interested in what was going on here?
The key person was Landry Bowling, who had participated in the Dartmouth Conference in the 70s. I'm not sure quite when he started, but I know he was involved by 1975. And then he used to come to see me in the government to talk about his insights from the Dartmouth conferences. So he was involved, and he recommended to the Kettering Foundation that they ask me to be the U.S. co-chair because of my government career, in which I was responsible for many of the conflicts that were going to be considered there. I might mention two other people with whom I was in fairly regular contact in the 70s when I was in government, in addition to Landry Bowling. One, of course, was Herb Kellman. I was quite aware of the dialogues that he was beginning, and he actually came to talk with me on a number of occasions about what he was perceiving, particularly in the Israeli-Arab and then especially Palestinian field.
Right.
The other was Vamek Volkan, who held a meeting of Israelis and Arabs, non-official, in Washington about the time we were at Camp David in 1978.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So there was an interesting comparison of insights. And I might add one other thing here. While I was in government, I, as I said, headed the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. In that bureau at that time, as an office director, was Joe Montville. And Joe at that time was, for very personal reasons, exploring the psychological dimensions of conflict and its resolution. And of course, later became a close colleague of Vamek Volkan. And it was they who helped me to articulate from my own personal experience some of the phenomena that I was experiencing in the diplomatic realm. And perhaps I should just tell one personal story here for a moment, because it brings all of this together. My wife died the day before the '73 war started, and so I was flying on the Kissinger shuttles and engaged in my own process of mourning. As you know, Joe Montville and Vamek Volkan have done a lot about groups mourning,
Right.
which is quite relevant, of course, with the Israelis as survivors of the Holocaust and Palestinians as survivors of the national catastrophe of 1948. So, first time I saw Golda Meir after the war was while Kissinger was meeting with Sadat in Cairo. They were having a long session about strategies for moving from the war forward into a more peaceful environment. But Joe Sisko and I went over to Israel to explain to Golda what Sadat and Kissinger were talking about. We happened to arrive on the day the casualty figures from the war were announced, and almost everybody in Israel knew somebody who was killed, missing, wounded. And it was like the biblical cloud hanging over the land. Golda came over and took my hand and said, I'm terribly sorry about your loss. I lost a lot of people too. I guess we feel somewhat the same. So it was, in a way, an affirmation to me that I needed to maintain my awareness of the human dimensions of the conflict, and to come back to my thread of thought. It was Joe Montville and then Vamek who helped me to articulate in a large group setting the instincts that were coming from my own personal experience. And then when I left government, about the same time as I became involved in the Dartmouth Conference, I became involved in some of the dialogues Vamek was continuing to conduct between Israelis and Palestinians.
Tell me a little bit about your writing of the other walls. That obviously came out of your experience in the Middle East in the 1970s, but it was very specifically about certain aspects which probably weren't covered by the traditional diplomatic world.
Well, that began in probably 1984 or 85. The idea then was maybe to produce a piece about the Arab-Israeli peace process that would be on the table when a new administration, either a renewed or a new administration, came to office in the United States after the 1986, 84 elections.
I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, 84.
84.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I guess I started in 83 and published in 84.
84.
And but the idea there was very clear that I was bringing this sense of a psychological dimension into the thinking about the peace process. The other walls, the very title of the book, came from the peroration to Sadat's speech before the Israeli Knesset during his visit to Israel, when he said, after outlining the diplomatic issues between the two countries, that there's another wall between us, and it's a wall of suspicion and hatred and misperceived deeds. And that's why I say that the problem between us is 70% psychological. So when I wrote the book, it was with two thoughts in mind. One, the human walls that blocked progress toward negotiation, and my sense that there was a process in the peace process. So I wrote about the negotiating process more as a former official than I did about an unofficial process.
The Dartmouth process was obviously very central in the introduction to the field for you. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and how it actually came about in the early 1980s that you were involved in that?
Well, the Regional Conflicts Task Force became the laboratory in which I learned the process that later on, a decade or more later, I was to call sustained dialogue. But I think it's fair to say, you can correct me on this, that the fact that we had the luxury in the Regional Conflicts Task Force of meeting every 6 months for most of a decade was unique. Now, that could be wrong, but I think it was certainly unusual, if not literally unique. But we brought increasingly the same group of people back together over and over again on the average of every 6 months under the same co-chairman. And initially it was really the same group of people on the American side, and it took Primakov a while to experiment with membership on his side. But nevertheless, what we discovered very quickly was that bringing the same people back together repeatedly creates 4 opportunities. One is the opportunity to develop a cumulative dialogue. By that I mean questions left hanging at the end of one meeting can be worked on between meetings and shape the agenda for the next meeting. So, there is a cumulative buildup of the dialogue. As Primakov said one time, we will start the next meeting where this one ended. And that had two meanings. One is the substantive meaning about the development of a dialogue out of the dialogue, but it also meant something else in the then Soviet-U.S. relationship. It meant that he said, we'll cut out the polemic at the beginning of each meeting. You have heard our position, and we don't need to repeat it. And that saved about 3 hours in every meeting. So the first thing we learned about repeating meetings was the ability to carry forward a cumulative dialogue. Second, we created a common body of knowledge. And by that I don't just mean that we learned very clearly what the Soviet position on X problem was and vice versa, but we learned why it was what it was. They learned a lot about what political forces in the United States shaped our interests and our positions. And we learned more than they probably wanted us to understand about the internal workings of their system, much more certainly than many Americans have ever fathomed. So the common body of knowledge, but reaching down to the why do you really care about this level instead of what's your position. The third was that we of course learned a different way of talking. We really did move to an analytical way rather than a confrontational way of talking. And ultimately, though not in the 80s, only in the 90s, we learned that out of a dialogue like this, you can actually learn to work together, to do something together, and we'll come back to that in the 90s. But with these 4 lessons, it's not that we saw them all at once, but they evolved. And I would say another thing too. Ultimately, I conceptualized the process that we experienced in those dialogues as a 5-stage process, but that didn't come until the end of the decade. So as I look back now and try to analyze how we got to the point of conceptualizing a process, I tell myself that we did so because we had to deal with certain problems, which any group entering a dialogue has to deal with. Do people want to come to dialogue at all? And in some cases, in the middle of a civil war or a conflict, it may be very dangerous. So the question is whether they want to start a dialogue. That's a very beginning. If you decide to have a dialogue, then the question is, well, how are you going to name the problem that you're going to bring people together around? And the corollary to that is, who are the best people to bring together around that problem? Well, as I said, we had named the problem for the Regional Conflicts Task Force as what do we learn from the interactions of the superpowers in regional conflicts about the central U.S.-Soviet relationship. So the question was, how do you do that? And then if you start the meeting, well, what's your agenda going to be? Well, we started it by saying we want to talk about those conflicts in which we interact conflictually. So in the first meeting, we did a mapping of the conflicts. And we got people there who could deal with Europe, Middle East, Latin America, South Africa, to begin with. And so we solved that problem. And then as we went on, the question was how to organize our talk to move us beyond the initial review of the problem. And we actually, in retrospect, it looks as if we conducted 3 experiments. We would not have said that at the time, but we first decided that it happened quite by happenstance. Primakov and I were the Middle East people in the task force, aside from being co-chairman. And at the end of our presentations on the Middle East, we each, quite independently, went back mentally to the Nixon-Brezhnev Statement of Principles at their summit in 1972 and said, if you were going to have a code of conduct of the superpowers in the Middle East, what would it look like? What should govern our interactions there to keep this from becoming a direct superpower confrontation? So we decided that in a second meeting, that in itself was a decision, we'll have a second meeting, that we would use this question of what kind of principles should govern our interaction. And we took that into a second meeting. And we found that led us to a stone wall, because principles, non-intervention, non-interference, are defined very differently by the communist regime in Moscow and the other regime in Washington. So then we decided, well, maybe we should talk about our interests. And then it became a difference of view between, well, we Soviets have objective interests. We know what our interests are, and we make our policy accordingly. And I had said, in the United States, interests are determined at 2 levels. Yes, of course, analysts in the government, of whom I was one, write an analysis of the national interest as it is affected by X situation. But a president of the United States has to define his interest in terms of what the American people care about, what they give priority to at a certain time, and so on. And Primakov objected to that because he said, well, you Americans may have your interest groups and your crazy system, but we know what our interests are. Well, that led to a stonewall interest, and then we tried a couple of other devices, the most effective of which by 1984 or so became the idea of looking at a conflict like the Middle East and ultimately Afghanistan, and using a process of trying to develop scenarios of actions. How can we deal with this complex situation? And as Soviets had proposed an international conference on the Arab-Israeli problem, and we said, well, there's no point in having a conference. These people aren't ready to do anything together yet. None of them has decided to negotiate. So the issue is really, how do you prepare for a conference by bringing people to the point where Palestinians and Israelis are ready to negotiate with each other, et cetera. So, but we did have a very fruitful conversation of what the positions of parties in the Middle East were with reference to a negotiation, what it would take to get them there, who would want what in the negotiations. And so we had a very insightful meeting about this. And of course, through all of it, the question on our lips was, well, how would you get these two to do what they need to do toward each other, basis for coming to a negotiation? So that idea of scenario building, how would you put together the complex of actions in a situation where there are maybe 5 or 7 major actors, proved to be useful. Later, we extended that to the question of the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. How would you put that together in ways? And so on. So by experiment in the task force, we came to several devices that we did articulate to each other about how to organize a non-official dialogue in ways that prevented you from walking around the same track over and over again, but moved things forward. And so that was another device that we used. And it was really out of that experience over, I don't know, some 16 or 18 meetings by 1989, 90 that led me to write a paper for the annual meeting in San Francisco of the International Society of Political Psychology, where a lot of us tended to gravitate. I called the paper Thinking in Stages. I remember, I think it was 1989, I'd been at a meeting at Vamek Volkan's place at the University of Virginia, and I was coming back and thinking about how that meeting had come about, thinking about my own experience in the Dartmouth conference, thinking about some of the Herb Kellman dialogues that I'd participated in. And I remember I picked up my handheld dictating machine in the car driving from Charlottesville back to my home in McLean, Virginia. And I wrote a letter back to Vamek and said, you know, it seems to me that these dialogues that we're working with evolve through a series of stages. And I laid them out in this. He actually published my letter in his journal, Mind and Human Interaction. So then I began working more on the idea of stages, but that was the beginning of the conceptualization of a process that somewhere in the mid-90s, when I was writing my book, A Public Peace Process, with the subtitle Sustained Dialogue to Transform Racial and Ethnic Relationships, somehow in writing that book I asked myself, well, what is this process anyway? And I knew it was dialogue, I knew it was non-official. I knew Joe Montville called it Track 2 diplomacy. I knew that the Kettering Foundation in the 80s, and I was in a consultation relationship with them then, we called it supplemental diplomacy. For a while, but I objected to that because in some conflicts it isn't supplemental, it was the only act in town. And second, it wasn't diplomacy at all, and as a former diplomat I sort of resented the idea of not recognizing that diplomacy is official and with credentialed people and so on. But anyway, we'd experimented with names, and finally I just said to myself, well, what have I been engaged in? I've been engaged in dialogue, and it has been sustained. I mean, here I am, 18 meetings later into this Dartmouth task force anyway, and it has certainly been sustained. I have concluded that the old realist paradigm, the power politics model for studying international relations, just doesn't help in the current world. It's not that it's all wrong by any means, but the states will continue to be the organizing unit of international relations, no question about it. In some cases, such as Iraq, at one point, not maybe today, but it was a problem of states. But for me, a state-centered view of conflict or international relations or domestic politics is just too limiting. For me, the area of activity is the whole body politic, and that includes citizens outside government as well as citizens inside government. And so for me, operating in this broader field and saying, yes, there's some things only governments can do, such as negotiate peace treaties, but there's some things that only citizens outside government can do, such as make peace. Governments are terrible at trying to transform conflictual human relationships. Only citizens outside government can transform conflictual human relationships, modify human behavior, change political culture. That's not what governments are good at. So we need a paradigm that's large enough to embrace both lines of activity, and the ultimate, the ideal, of course, is to find a way across the gulf between citizens in and out of government so that the two can meaningfully work together. And I think there's been progress on this. And there was a period of time, which you very well remember, when those of us who are outside government regarded as meddlers in the official process. And maybe I was one of those when I was in government to some extent, although not rigorously so, because I valued what Herb Kelman did, VAMIC was doing, that I knew about at the time. But now there is a gulf between the two, and I understand lots of the reasons for it, having been on both sides of that gulf. But we have to put a very solid and broad bridge across that gulf now. And the only way to do that, in an academic sense, is to broaden the old paradigm and think in terms of a process of continuous interaction between whole bodies politic and not just government-to-government relations.
Well, let me push you a bit further on that, because one of the things that the field, whatever we call it, conflict resolution or conflict transformation, has always tried to be practical and utilitarian and to make its ideas helpful in the practicalities of bringing about some kind of change or some kind of peaceful relationships. How successful do you think we've been looking back over the last 20, 30 years? What do you think?
It's an incredibly difficult question to address, as you very well know, and painfully difficult for me, because I have been on both sides, and I know what I felt when I was in government, and I know what I feel today. But first of all, I think we have to put aside a lot of the methods of answering questions like that are common in the academic social sciences. The answers are not quantitative. They are qualitative. And one has to take a longer time frame as well. I remember the first grants I got for my work in Tajikistan, somebody said, well, what are you going to do in the period of a 2-year grant? Well, my answer was, first of all, I don't really know what's going to be possible. Second, if I thought I did, it probably would be wise not to tell you, because being too rigid about your objectives at the beginning of a process is going to close some doors to those things that happen in the course of the process that you can't anticipate at the beginning. So my picture is an open-ended political process. Now, how do you measure results in the course of that? In answer to your question, I would say that people in the government now recognize this field as legitimate and helpful. That was not true at the beginning. People were, this is none of your business outside government. You're going to mess up what we're doing, and so on. I don't sense any of that at all today. So I think there's been tremendous progress. Where there has been less progress, I think, is on each side. There's been less progress, and that is on the government side, recognizing what it is they can learn from this kind of activity that they can't learn doing what they're doing between governments. And on our side now of the fence, it's articulating what we've learned in a way that says something to governments. Now, my feeling is that neither side is good at this right now, but what I've learned is that if you want to get a policymaker's attention, you don't dribble in some little piece of information that you've got, that because they probably know much of that, if not almost anything that you can provide. One thing that people outside can say sometimes is, I think you're making the wrong assumption. Another thing is that you in government have not been able to address this issue for a whole variety of understandable political reasons. For instance, the issue of Jerusalem at the end of the 1980s in the Arab-Israeli talks. Nobody would talk about it. We have talked about it outside government, and we have some ideas to offer here. So the introduction of those ideas can be useful regardless of the conflict, but they somehow, I think, have to address fundamentals. If they do, then it's going to be hard to quantify, but you can go to anybody and say, people were not talking about Jerusalem. People in the formal diplomatic process could not find people in Israel or in the Palestinian world who would be willing to think about a compromise. And we have done that. Here's what it looks like. It's not all that frightening. So when you can go and do that, I think it's useful. So I think we are learning and have some good examples of how that happens, but it requires people in the foundation world to recognize the legitimacy of these things as achievements.
And in the 90s, what happened to the idea of dialogue, which you were beginning to develop out of the Dartmouth process? The early 90s, of course, the Soviet Union had collapsed. So where did you go from there?
I mentioned that by the end of the 80s, I was beginning to see this process as a process that evolved through stages. So against that background, I did work on that in 1989, 90, and so on. But the best way to make the transition, I think, is to cite a decision that was made in the Dartmouth Regional Conflicts Task Force in December of 1992. You'll recall that at the end of 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, became the Russian Federation and the Commonwealth of Independent States. So in the task force, in addition to living with our Russian colleagues as they went through the traumatic experience of absorbing the fact that their country no longer existed, which is a traumatic experience for anybody, which I fortunately haven't had to absorb. But in any case, the question was, well, what do we do now in this task force? This was a task force on U.S.-Soviet interactions in regional conflicts. In short, we decided to do three things. One was to concentrate on the new Russian-U.S. relationship. Second was to finish conceptualizing the process of sustained dialogue as we have known it, so that, third, we could apply it in one of the conflicts that had broken out on the territory of the former Soviet Union. And by 1993, we had published an article in Negotiation Journal which laid out the 5 stages of sustained dialogue.
I recall.
And then I actually did that with my then Russian colleague, the co-chair of the Dartmouth Regional Conflicts Task Force, Gennady Chufrin, who had succeeded Primakov in 1989 as Primakov rose into the ranks of government. So we also decided at the end of 1992 that we would try to apply the process in the former Soviet Republic of Tajikistan. I won't go into the reasons for that decision particularly, but the long and short of it was with the 3 Americans and 3 Soviets in the task force were deputized to attempt this experiment. The 2 Soviets went to Tajikistan, talked to over 100 people, explained what the Dartmouth Conference was and how it had served the 2 superpowers during the Cold War, and asked them whether they would like to come into that space, that we were willing to make our space available to them to discuss their civil war. And so we held the first, it was called an experimental meeting in March of 1993 with 10 Tajiks and these 3 Americans and 3 Russians in a 3-day meeting. That was the beginning of what the Tajiks ultimately called the inter-Tajik dialogue within the framework of the Dartmouth Conference. Our Russian colleagues had said, well, they wouldn't come to a Soviet or a Russian meeting. They probably wouldn't come to an American meeting. They wouldn't come to a Russian meeting without the Americans. And what they would come to was a meeting convened by an international movement, quote unquote. And that was the Dartmouth Conference.
Okay.
So that started what came to be called the inter-Tajik dialogue. Actually, to be correct, it should have been the intra-Tajik dialogue, because it was a place where most of the main factions in the then very heated and vicious Civil War came together in the dialogue. So we got started that way. And if I won't go into detail about the history of the Inter-Tajik dialogue, but I would say that we had 6 meetings in the first 12 months. A very intensive process. I might say 6 3 or 4 day meetings. What's interesting about that is that those 6 meetings, in a way, demonstrated the legitimacy of the 5 stages of sustained dialogue as we had conceptualized them. I'm deliberately using the word conceptualize the process because the process of sustained dialogue did not come about because we sat down and looked at a wall and said, well, okay, let's have a process that goes through 5 stages. We looked back, thought back over a decade of experience of these semi-annual meetings, plus my experiences in Israeli-Palestinian meetings and others, and we said, it seems that if you bring the same people back together, their relationships, their way of interacting, their way of working, seems to evolve through a discernible pattern. And you can capture that by talking about 5 stages. So in the first year of the Tajik dialogue, in effect, the participants went through the 5 stages very, very neatly. When we started the Dartmouth Regional Conflicts Task Force, we didn't have a 5-stage process. We didn't have a concept of relationship to talk about transforming. When we started the Tajik dialogue, we had both. And so one could say that it was a test, passed the test beautifully, and I think vindicated the notion. In essence, they sat down at a time when there was no other real communication between the government and a very fragmented opposition. And in the course of that year, they formed the United Tajik Opposition. They came up with a platform. The government decided to negotiate. The UN mediator offered UN mediation, and they actually set a date for starting the mediation in April 1994. The point here, though, is that the task force worked its way through this process through that year, ending the year, writing a joint memorandum on a negotiating process in Tajikistan. So they'd clearly gone from being very close to unable to talk with each other on through naming the problem. What we really need to talk about is how to start a negotiation. And then another meeting on, well, how would you start a negotiation? There's a government here, but there's a fragmented opposition there. I still remember somebody saying, well, who are you, the opposition? If we were to invite you to a negotiation, who would come? What are your phone numbers? How would we invite you? And so on. Well, they solved that by forming their own negotiation. Then they exchanged the platform. Pro-government people took it back to the government decided to negotiate and so on. Now, this goes back to your earlier question, what have we learned to accomplish? I can tell that story in a way that makes the task force quite central to the actual beginning of negotiation. On the other hand, I can't claim that the task force deserves exclusive credit for that, because in any complex political situation, we all know there are many inputs to a decision or an event or a development. And all I can say is, yes, this task force played, I think, a significant role. Were they responsible for the beginning of negotiations? No, not entirely. So anyway, we sort of vindicated the 5-stage process, and I won't go through the rest of the stages, but the dialogue continued when the negotiations started. So we had an interesting experience in that 3 members of the dialogue became members of the negotiating teams, 2 on the opposition side and 1 on the government side. So we had the experience of an interaction between non-official dialogue and official mediation negotiation that went on to a peace treaty in June 1997, and out of that, partly because of the recommendation of the dialogue, the peace treaty established a Commission on National Reconciliation to oversee the implementation of the peace treaty, and 5 people from the dialogue were members of that commission. So we went through the 90s. In the year 2000, the members of the dialogue formed their own non-governmental organization to carry what they had learned in the way of an approach to politics and negotiation into the body politic of Tajikistan. Meanwhile, through all that, from 93 to 99, I was writing my book focusing on sustained dialogue, or what I called a public peace process. I chose the title because when I wrote The Other Walls, it was really as a former Assistant Secretary of State mediator writing about the official peace process, the work of governments. This was a book about the non-official dialogue, but dialogue among people in the policy influencing communities, so I called it public to distinguish it from official peace process. But in the course of it, I actually came to the name Sustained Dialogue, and the book describes the 5 stages and so on. That was published in 99.
So looking ahead, where would you like to see the field go in the next decade or so? What would you like us to do, perhaps better than we've done in the past?
I believe that we're in the business of transforming a political culture. I said before that governments aren't very good at modifying human behavior, transforming conflictual relationships, or changing political culture. I think we've gotten pretty good at the transforming conflictual relationships part of the agenda, where we have been able to apply it. I think we need to expand the arenas in which we apply what we know how to do. What that means is more money plus additional practitioners, who I think are coming out of our various programs and conflict management, conflict resolution, conflict transformation. But having a world, a corporate world, a governmental world, a foundation world, recognize that we really need to transform the political culture. There is in another field not commonly thought of as directly part of conflict resolution, something called the civic renewal movement, which has to do more with deliberative democracy and citizen engagement and so on. I see that as not very distant from what we do. And I'm not one who wants to be a purist about methods. I think there's an array of methods here that are applicable in communities, in all sorts of settings, and it's only when we are able to use this in many settings that the way people relate will be transformed. I think that's a big aspiration, to change the political culture to a genuine culture of peace or democracy or conflict transformation or whatever one wants to call it, but that's what I see. I might add just one analytical thought here that I haven't said anything about, if I may, for just a second. There are many worthy processes which are part of the field of conflict transformation. And I think what we might want to pay more attention to in a relatively small sphere is diagnosis of the conflicts to determine which of the processes is going to be most usable in that particular conflict. And I have, for myself, without any sense of that sustained dialogue is better than other processes, I've simply tried to define myself the niche that sustained dialogue offers. Well, if we were to do that with other processes, we would be able to say, here's our analysis of this conflict. It seems to us that people aren't ready to engage in collaborative processes, be they negotiation, mediation, or others. Therefore, we need to turn to a process that focuses on transforming the relationships that cause their conflict so that they can go on to the more collaborative things. So we'll choose sustained dialogue for that. But on the other hand, if our analysis is such that, well, this is a dispute over divisible property, goods, whatever, therefore that's for mediation and negotiation. So whatever it is, we have a field of practice, we have a field of analysis and literature. We need the diagnosis that connects the practice with the field, and then to use the breadth of the field to say, we're about the transformation of political culture.
Okay. All right, instead of looking forward, Hal, let's look back a little bit. And are there things in the past that you think we could have done better, or things that we didn't do that we should have done, things which were a little disappointing to you?
Well, I think I would look back with considerable regret on when I try to answer the field where, well, what impact have you had? We had this elaborate process of dialogue during the 80s with Americans and Soviets. If you go back and read the record, it was brilliant conversation and analysis and so on. And in a couple of instances, it did have an impact. For instance, during the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think we were directly involved in the dialogue. But there weren't that many of those. For all of the effort, there weren't that many of those. In Tajikistan, I think we really did have an impact, and that's rather satisfying. But you look around and say, well, okay, so you've got an NGO in Tajikistan, you've got 7 regional dialogues. Government doesn't seem to be, the political institutions of the place don't seem to have been influenced. So it's the whole question of that we really haven't, for 20 years of work, been able to make a major dent in how governments respond to all of this work. And that's a major disappointment in a way for me.
Why do you think it's been so difficult? Why do you think it's...
Well, I look back to my time in government, and I would say very simply 1 or 2 things. Central is the fact that when a government gets involved in dealing with a complex problem like the Arab-Israeli conflict, or like the Iraq of 2005, it absorbs tremendous energy. And presidents take positions and lay down policies, and tremendous resources go into the implementation of those policies. Like all of us, they don't have time to absorb anything else. And they've got a momentum and a tremendous commitment to what they're doing, and they really don't have time to listen to others. I could say the same thing about myself in a very small level. I've spent a lot of energy developing this process of sustained dialogue, and we're doing what we can in a very small institute, and I really don't have time to do what somebody else does. I mean, I'll go to somebody else's dialogue if they ask me to, and lend my presence for a few days, but this is my process, and this is what I'm invested in, so I'm just, in a way, closed-minded about what I'm doing as government is. I might